Au-dessus des vieux volcans, glisse tes ailes sous le tapis du vent. Voyage, voyage, éternellement. De nuages en marécage.
Anyways, man is a wolf to man. Yes, there goes the saying. We all know it, we've all heard it, but today we're going to examine and get into the details of the man who had that thought, that man is a wolf to man.
Where does that thought come from? Who came up with it? In what conditions? And why? So today we're looking at, you might be able to guess from the title, but I would say one of the most important books in the Western canon in general, but in social thought for sure. We're looking at Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan.
The Leviathan.
Hobbes, we could say, is the first political scientist, and for many reasons. Because he finds himself situated in that period where the scientific method is changing the thought of the West, the zeitgeist, if I might use that Hegelian term. We're in a period now where the scientific method is offering new answers to questions, and Hobbes views himself as being that person who can apply these new methods to social thought, treating the social aspect of the human life as a science, adopting the material physics, adopting the practices of material science to social science. And this is the work of the Leviathan.
So first of all, what's the Leviathan? It comes from the Bible. It's a monster. It's a monster that has 3 heads, crocodile, dragon, and
the serpent.
And the serpent,
Yes.
right? It's the Leviathan in the Bible. It goes by saying he has no master on earth.
On earth, there is no master of him.
Meaning, Hobbes used to qualify the Leviathan as being the state, right? Because the state has no master above it. It is the master of the affairs of men.
Yes, it is the most powerful creature on earth. And that distinction on earth is very relevant because we're now in a period where there is this growing rupture between the church and the state. In the past, in Machiavelli's time, let's say, the power of the state was derived from the church, from the what is ecclesiastical, we might say.
Yes,
In
canonic.
Yes, in that sense, the state is the representative of God on earth, and people followed the commands of the state because they were the commands of God. In that sense, political law is the transfiguration of divine law.
Completely.
But now we're in a period where we are witnessing the Reformation, the
Let's
Protestantism.
discuss about the context. When did Thomas Hobbes write that book, and why?
So
What was happening?
Let's look at this.
First of all, where is he from?
He's from England.
Right. What was happening in England at that time?
Well, it was 1642 roughly.
What happened?
Well, King Charles was on the run.
Yes.
He was being chased by Oliver Cromwell.
I see. So it was a period of chaos and turmoil.
Violence was ubiquitous. It was the English Civil War. King Charles was on the run. The parliamentarian army of Cromwell was pitted against the king's men of King Charles. Hobbes was running for his life because Hobbes was a famous preceptor, you know. He was tutoring the young King Charles, the future King Charles in exile, while the real King Charles at the time being was clashing against Oliver Cromwell. So in some sense, this is Thomas Hobbes' internal dialogue. The Leviathan, you might understand it as Thomas Hobbes' internal dialogue in this period of inevitable violence. And Hobbes thinks that he now has the solutions, given the whole scientific method. He now has the solutions to test people's old assumptions about politics and political order and produce a new political order and finally create that stability on England. Now, there would be a certain stability for some time following the English Civil War, but it wouldn't last long because you'd have the Glorious Revolution in 1688 not that long after.
So England was in a period of turmoil, of
Yes.
chaos. It was all against all. It was Protestants represented by Oliver Cromwell against King
Charles.
Who was Catholic. His wife was a French princess who was Catholic, and that didn't please the people from the countryside in England, correct? So it was a war of all against all, and Thomas Hobbes prevented, we could say, or maybe established a certain, scholarly work to prevent the coming back of what he called the state of nature.
Yes.
Key word, the state of nature. So what is the state of nature?
Thomas Hobbes definitely felt like he lived in the state of nature, seeing the violence which pervaded the English countryside. Now, let's go back to that statement that Hobbes is the first political scientist. He's applying the scientific method to social science to produce a political theory. Now, the objective of any political theory is the production of a social order. And what is science? If the end result of our science is a social order, we need a definition for science. Science is a knowledge of consequences. Take chemistry, for example. If I have this element and I react it with this one, on these conditions, it will produce this result. Hobbes is doing the same thing for men. So he needs to begin with the basic ingredient of the society, which is man, the individual.
The study of men.
Yes.
The study of men's passions, of men's inclinations,
Yes.
and of men's desires. So Thomas Hobbes used to talk about the state of nature as being that chaos where man is against man. All men are against all men. And he used to say that that was the basis of every society. It was every man against every man. Yes. Man is a wolf to man at the essence. Now, what would happen after the establishment of the fact that man is a wolf to man? Well, we could say that there's something called covenants. Man established covenants between themselves to be more predictable to the other. For example, Nikita, you're not going to steal, I'm not going to steal. Deal?
Agreement.
Okay.
And if we don't, what happens?
If we break the covenant,
the Leviathan strikes us with his sword.
The Leviathan, the state, meaning,
yes,
is going to enforce our covenant.
Yes.
If you sign a contract, a business contract, for example, between yourself and somebody else, right? Who's the third party who's going to enforce and assure the application of that covenant between you and the second party?
It is the man of the law.
It is the man of the law, which is?
The Leviathan.
Which is?
The state.
The state.
The sovereign.
Completely. So Thomas Hobbes has written that scholarly work, in a prevention, to prevent the English elites from not getting into a deeper chaos, from not getting into what he calls, again, the state of nature, all against all.
He's trying to prevent man from returning or prolonging that state. Now, we begin with man in the state of nature. Man, for him, is, well, first of all, the state of nature, he says famously in chapter 13, if you want to skip through the whole Leviathan, chapter 13 is where it gets really nasty. Chapter 13, he drops that famous line, he says, life is nasty, brutish, and short. There is no commodious living, there is no navigation, there is no innovation, because imagine, Hobbes is also credited with founding liberalism, and we'll get into that in a second, but the objective of liberalism is the growth of the individual. Now, in a state where individuals are constantly slaughtering each other, in a state of kill or get killed, there is no opportunity to produce the navigation, the commodious living, the vanity, the beauty, and the cultural production. So what is man compelled by? We can imagine man as being some object of Newtonian mechanics. I see Hobbes as being influenced by Sir Isaac Newton. Newton says an object will only enter motion if acted upon by an external force. And what is the force which acts upon man? It is his passion. Now, we are in the age of enlightenment, reason is proliferating, so on and so forth, yada, yada, yada. But just because man has reason doesn't mean he is set into motion by reason. Rather, he is set into motion by passion.
Exactly, like every man fights against every man in the state of nature to get the resources, to get the status and
the wealth, the fame,
safety.
Yes.
So there are three stages in Hobbes' analysis. First of all, it's the safety. Man fights against the other man for the safety. Once that's achieved, he's going to fight for the resources. And once that's secured, he's going to fight, thirdly and mostly, for status, to elevate his hierarchical role in society. Now, for example, we could even say that history is made by men, yes, but what is history?
Women.
Women, correct? What is the whole history of humanity? Is men fighting each other for women?
Men innovating for the cause of women.
Completely.
Producing safety, order, architecture, and so on.
Woman is life, and woman chooses who's going to partake, who's going to be in that gene pool, who's going to have eternal life. We could even say in a quite Wagnerian vocabulary.
Germanic sense.
In a quite Germanic or even Wagnerian vocabulary. Woman is the Valkyrie, who's going to grant the hero eternity.
Into Valhalla.
Eternity. Valhalla meaning eternity, meaning
yes.
reproduction. Woman is going to choose who's going to partake into the gene pool. So history is nothing more than man innovating, fighting, and gaining status for the sake of women.
I love that analysis because you took the English thinking of Hobbes,
yes.
the empiricism of Hobbes,
yes.
and then you combined it with the kind of Germanic philosophy of self-actualization.
Completely.
We were talking earlier about Nietzsche's will to power.
Yes.
And some of that philosophy appears even in the work of Hobbes.
Yes.
Why is that? It's because, well, man seeks to man seeks to conserve himself. And the acquisition of wealth, resources, and so on are things which are productive to his conservation. How does man acquire these things? Well, it often happens that two men desire the same thing. Two men desire the same thing, the same object, which grants them or promotes their conservation. Now, one man having it and the other man not having it, the one seeks to claim it from the other. This is called predation. And for predation to exist, it means one must be the prey. In fact, I think it even comes from the French word prendre, to take.
Yes, completely.
That's where the word predator comes from. To take. It is a zero-sum game. For you to acquire something, the other person has to lose it. And the best way to do it, or not the best way, but ultimately, what it comes to in the state of nature, in a domain where there is no laws and no state to prevent man from eating the other man, it means you must kill the other man. It is in the state of nature. What it means is...
In chaos.
In chaos.
In the absence of the state.
In the absence of law.
And now, some people might say that Hobbes is a complete lunatic regarding the state, because Hobbes says that the state must be completely absolute. The state must be in control of all the affairs of men. Now, what he meant by that was that, look at nowadays. For the detractors who did not believe in his analysis of the nature of men, he used to say, when you go out, you lock your home's door. When, for example, nowadays, when you get out of your car, you lock your car. When you sleep, you lock your home. When you build gates around your home, you have borders around your country. Why? Because you are suspicious. You are suspicious against every single man. You are suspicious against the unknown. And that is why Thomas Hobbes needed the state to be absolute, and that, we could say, is an idea of the Cardinal de Richelieu, who was the father of French centralization.
Gallicanism, even.
Gallicanism,
Yes.
completely. So the Cardinal de Richelieu was the one who raised Louis XIV into becoming that absolute monarch from divine right, and hence centralizing the Château de Versailles into that entity that would englobe all the nobility. Because let's remember, Louis XIV's father, Louis XIII, had lots of uprisings coming from the nobility.
Le Fronde, for example.
The
most famous of which.
Completely. And that shocked Louis XIV.
He was a young child at the time.
Exactly. He used to wake up at night and he had to flee from Paris to Versailles. Versailles was just a domain. It was just a...
It was a hunting cottage.
Exactly.
In the outskirt of Paris.
Exactly. That is why he expanded that hunting cottage, of course under the supervision of the Cardinal de Richelieu, who wanted to centralize the country by building that fastidious hotel, that golden prison.
That fortress.
Where nobility would live. And that is the beginning of the centralization of the state, the modern state that we have today. And we could say that that could derive from the ideas of Thomas Hobbes or be a cause of it.
No, I like that. Hobbes provides a good lens for looking at the centralization of the French government under the Cardinal Richelieu. And so a mainstay of the liberal philosophy is this idea that government is unnatural. Government doesn't occur in nature. You can't pick government out of the tree, you can't harvest government from the soil, and you cannot dig it from the rocks. We invented government. Government is our covenant. And it's our interest. It's in our interest to produce this government. How is the government formed? So you have the state of nature, and the state of nature coincides inevitably with the state of war. Because without laws, men will do whatever they must in the name of their right of nature. That's the technical terminology for those who study political theory. They will employ their right of nature to prolong their conservation. Right of nature means violence. So the state of war and the state of nature inevitably overlap with each other.
And to a certain extent, we still live in a state of nature.
I really want to touch on this.
But that has been softened. For example, me and Nikita, right after that, we're going to want to eat, for example, we're going to have food, correct? And we're going to check who's going to pay. Now, to induce the other to pay, we're not going to get violent towards each other. We're going to have a great match of rock, paper, scissors, and I'm going to win.
I'm going to win.
Well.
Let's be real.
Well.
My rock is going to be bigger than your rock.
Oh, shit.
And we already see us degenerating into the state of nature. That's why we need agreements. which is somehow we have an agreement amongst ourselves, which is the production of this lovely podcast, this lovely emission we're producing, the Friday Salon. It represents a sort of covenant. It represents a sort of decency. It represents a sort of agreement amongst men to contain their more vicious nature. And that is the purpose of the state. It is in your own interest, allegedly, as Hobbes would allege, to obey your state. Because otherwise you revert to that state of nature and you're compelled to fight your fellow man. And your fellow man is compelled to fight you, and it results in an inevitable violence.
So man at the beginning decided to just give away his personal interest, a part of his personal interest,
A portion of it.
a portion of
Yes.
it, which, for example, we could say that a physically fit and strong man could simply grab the sandwich of the physically weaker man in the streets.
Yes.
Correct? He could.
It's the bully in the high school cafeteria.
The bully, for example.
Yes.
But the bully decided to give away that portion of his
of his power, let's say. Of his
of his power, of his capabilities, in the name, because every bully has a bully himself.
Yes.
The strong man could be the weak man for another man. So each one of them decided to give away their personal power in the name of the general will and interest.
Now that's a very Rousseauian term, but the reason why the bully decides not to steal the sandwich of the smaller guy is because it works like this. There's always a bigger fish, and the bigger fish eats the small fish, grow up, deal with it. It's that simple. The small kid fears the bully, but the bully fears the principal, and the principal fears the school board, and the school board fears the Minister of Education, and the Minister of Education fears
The
who else?
state, the
state.
Leviathan.
The state, right? And it's for this reason that order prevails, roughly, in the liberal contract.
Yes, and we all know that order creates,
Freedom,
and this order engenders
servitude.
completely.
That's how it works.
And for anyone, for any state, for any political entity to evolve, to innovate, there needs to be order.
Right, because order creates a condition for us to innovate, to pursue things like culture, science, the things which result in the commodious living. When there is disorder and each man is pitted against the other in a brutal, ruthless, all against all confrontation, there is no commodious living. There's no commodious living. We were talking about man employing his right of nature in the name of his particular interest. Well, it turns out to be in his particular interest, his interest being preservation, to form a government. So man submits his right of nature. You can imagine each man is holding a sword, right? And in the state of nature, each man holds a sword. In order to form the government, each man submits his sword.
Why?
They smelt it down, and they make an even bigger sword.
Because the state, according to Hobbes, has the monopoly of
The
violence.
use of power.
Of the use of power, of violence.
In fact, that's Max Weber,
Max Weber
the
too.
German sociologist, roughly the 1850s. So imagine, Hobbes in the 1650s was foreseeing the development of the modern state, which Max Weber would pick up on in the 1850s. If that doesn't indicate to you the importance of Hobbes to the Western canon,
We could even say that Louis XIV, by centralizing the state, by building that
Chateau de Versailles.
that golden prison, the Chateau de Versailles, decided to centralize violence. He was the one who had the power of the sword. Your local warlord, your local baron, couldn't be the one waving the sword. It was the king, the direct king. It was, we could even say, Saint Paul making appeal to Caesar directly and not to Pontius Pilate, going directly to the local authority. Caesar is ruling, not the local ruler. Centralization of the state. We could even say that religion has a lot to do with the state itself. For example, when God is absolute and watches all the affairs of men, like in France, for example, in Catholicism, the king is a king from divine right.
He is simply the representative of God on earth.
Exactly. He represents the centralization of the state. And for example, in a regime, in a state where, according to its religion, God is certainly omnipotent but doesn't get involved into the affairs of men, well, the king himself is a king by constitutional right and not divine right. So we could even say that religion will directly affect the state, the functioning of the state.
The outcomes of a state's development of the development of its political apparatus,
Completely.
you might say. Interesting. Now, Hobbes was writing against the revolutionaries. Cromwell was the revolutionary, the parliamentarian that wanted to overthrow the king. But in fact, we might even say that Hobbes is the real revolutionary. And I'll say why Hobbes is the real revolutionary. He founds political science, the founder of the political science discipline. He founds this tradition called the social contract, which is a genre of political philosophy, which gave rise to there were variations. Hobbes laid down the foundation of it. Rousseau made a variation, which gave rise to the French Revolution. And then John Locke made a variation of it, which gave rise to the American Revolution, right? So Hobbes, in trying to protest a revolution,
Made himself a revolution.
made himself a revolutionary, gave rise to two more revolutions. It could be it could easily be one of the most consequential works in Western social thought.
He's the essence of counter-revolutions.
Yes.
Yes.
Which eat themselves eventually. Saturn devouring his children.
I like that.
Do you know that painting?
No, I'll tell you. That's a quote from a French revolutionary scholar. La révolution est comme Saturne. Elle finit par dévorer ses enfants. Revolution is like Saturn.
Yes.
It ends by devouring its children.
Crazy.
And completely, because the revolution never stops. Any revolution never...
Because think of the meaning of that word revolution. Turning. It's just turning.
Completely.
That's all it is.
And like, it wants to purify. It's always dangerous when people say we want to purify society or whatever.
We want to revolt. We want to... Blah, blah, blah.
It's the root of all evil, because by trying to purify, well, we could bring really demonic and even pervert ideas, and they themselves don't even know when to stop, right? Danton, Robespierre decided to purify society. Well, after that, it was their turn, because they were
their turn to be purified.
right? Because they were the extremists at first, but then they've even engendered more extreme people than them, and you could say they were the far left, they became the far right.
Yes.
So it never stops.
No.
And that is why after all revolution you have Caesars.
Like Napoleon.
You have Napoleon.
Like Julius Caesar himself.
Julius Caesar himself, right?
Except in the that's crazy. Except in the American Revolution.
It is, yes.
Except in the American Revolution where you had George Washington.
Yes.
A humble man that said, okay, I'm only going to do 2 terms, and you're not going to call me divine emperor of the American continent. You're just going to call me president, like the president of a bowling club. And when I'm done, I'm going to retire after 2 terms, and I'm going to go farm. And nobody bother me ever again. That's the only circumstance.
That's what I truly believe, right? Work noisily, let success bring you silence.
Yes.
Correct?
A real Washingtonian himself.
Completely.
In the flesh, right next to me. That's ridiculous. I want to wrap up with some comments on Thomas Hobbes himself.
Yes.
Who was this guy? First of all, you got to understand, he is the one that translated Thucydides into English.
The first.
The first
Yes.
to translate Thucydides into English.
History of the Peloponnesian
Yes,
War.
and if you know Thucydides, you know what that means. First of all, it's a monstrous work. First of all, it's a big testimony to the unique and not even revolutionary. It's
Well, he's the father of Historia.
Yes.
Of history. History meaning the investigation of what happened.
Yes.
Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, of course, inspired the 300 movies.
yes.
Well, it was the first historical work. It was the first scholar who decided to take notes of what happened in pertaining the affairs of men.
In fact, Thucydides is somehow echoing the empiricism of Hobbes.
Yes,
know,
yes.
there's
No, we could say that Hobbes is echoing.
Yes.
Yes.
Crazy, crazy, crazy. But anyway, you know Thucydides is the founder of realism. You know Thucydides, he gives us that incredible Melian dialogue.
Thucydides' trap.
Yes, he gives us so many wisdoms about realpolitik, politics as it is. And Thomas Hobbes is witnessing politics as it is. The fact that he decides to translate Thucydides specifically into English lets you know that he thinks this is what the Anglophones need to hear right now. This is what the English people need to hear right now. They need some Thucydides to set them straight and figure out what's happening. So, a masterwork, a masterwork.
Politics is...
Ultimately coercive.
Politics is the fact of arguing with realities, with things as they are.
Yes.
And we could even say that Thucydides is the essence of
The realpolitik.
Machiavelli.
The realism, yes.
Of Machiavelli, of John Mersheimer nowadays, of the biggest scholars, I would
Henry
say.
Kissinger.
Henry
Yes.
Kissinger, Bismarck,
All of them.
Realpolitik. And it is quite interesting. He was a man of realities
Yes.
more than ideologies. And that is what we believe in the Friday Salon. We believe that realities, that interests are way more important than any ideology, and that ideologies are just a mean of achieving the interest.
The behaviors and decisions of men and states and nations are determined by their interests. In fact, we're even taking a page out of Hobbes right now. Men are simply pursuing their interests. That's it. That's it.
And of course, Nietzsche would even say that men could invent anything. They could bestow upon themselves any virtue to justify their pursuit of their own interests. But still, it is just a mean. It is just a justification. Man is a wolf to men. Well,
One last thing I want to say about Hobbes. There's a portrait of him in the National Gallery of London. It's on the top floor. And this portrait reveals the essence, the essential character of Thomas Hobbes. He's wearing a dark gown. The background is also dark. So it almost looks like he's blending in. You can't really see where the body of Hobbes begins. You can't. All you see is this balding man, his head, and his hand being revealed. The head representing the theoretical aspect, the hand representing the practical aspect. That could be one of the best portraits ever, because it represents the hand which wields the sword of the sovereign, and it represents Hobbes' mind, his head, conceiving this idea of this Leviathan, this powerful beast which inspires the fear and the respect of men, so that they may produce and obey the order of the day. Even the book, the cover piece of the book, reveals something about the Leviathan itself. We'll make some edits or whatever so it's more clear.
which
for you to see.
edition?
This is the Oxford World Classics edition.
Yes.
My favorite edition.
The scepter and the sword.
Yes, you can see the
Or we could even say that's the shepherd's,
staff.
right?
Yes.
Exactly.
You see different symbols in there. But the most relevant symbol is the conception of the Leviathan himself. You see this powerful man. He's wearing the crown, so he's most definitely the king. But you can see he's made up of a bunch of other different people. And that has to do with the idea of the social contract. That this sovereign, this Leviathan, is composed of all the different men. Can you see that?
Yes,
It's
completely.
the sovereign is the addition of all the other men. Hobbes is concerned.
Oh, I
Yes,
see.
you see that?
I see. He's the will
Yes.
of all the other men. He's the concentrated will of all other men.
Or the concentrated right of nature.
Yes,
And there's reveals something about international relations as well afterwards.
completely. That's the essence of it.
That's the essence of international
one for all and all for one.
Right? So the creation of the state is each man giving up his right of nature and submitting it to the state and entrusting the state with the right of nature. Each man giving up his sword and allowing it to be smelted by the state. You can even think of taxes.
Completely.
Taxes are part of your right of nature.
Yes.
So you're purchasing, or your money is your right of nature. It's your purchasing power. Your money helps you actualize yourself and pursue the things which result in your commodious living and your preservation. So you give up a portion of your, whether it's your money or your sword, you allow it to be smelted in order to create and fund a sovereign who will produce the order that will allow you to live commodiously and in peace with your peers.
And that would even help you to compete on a world stage.
Yes.
Because none of us can compete on a world stage.
No.
Correct?
No individual can compete on a world stage.
But if we unite all of us through taxes, for example, nowadays,
Yes.
we could compete on a world stage.
Exactly.
And that is the importance, hence the importance of taxes, of having that state, because we can see that nowadays the states all over the world, and especially in the West, are losing their apparatus to
Yes.
private companies,
Corporations.
corporations.
Can I point something out?
Please do.
We've said, when we were talking about the fact the government is a biblical sea monster. It's part crocodile, it's part serpent, it's part whatever, because on earth it has no master. And that's the analogy that Hobbes uses to describe the government.
Completely.
So government is a biblical sea monster because it's part crocodile, it's part serpent, it's part dragon. But ultimately, in the Bible it says it has no master on earth. On earth there is no creature superior to it. And this is the analogy that our political theorist uses to describe the state. Because on earth, the state is the most powerful creature, at least in that day. Today, though, we might say and the state is the most powerful creature because it inspires the most fear and the most respect. Today, though, we might say the most powerful creature is the corporation.
Well, honestly, I don't agree. I think the state is the corporation of all corporations. But it is losing ground more and more, more and more. We're seeing on many theaters, economic, even war theaters, it's losing ground to private companies. And I truly believe that...
Even mercenary groups, for example.
well, that's what I was talking about, but let's not get into the details. But like, it's losing ground on many topics, on many, like the service of the state has lost ground. Like there was a time when civil servants were men of purpose, were men of incredible literacy, were men who were versed in the classics.
Yes, the English civil service in the height of the Victorian period, they were all read on the classics. They were all experts on Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics. Yes.
Completely. The state was an affair of family for most.
Extended family.
Exactly. So nowadays the state, well, in many Western countries, it has become an affair of, especially since COVID, of being online in your apartment in the skies, in your little box in the skies.
Or your mother's basement.
Voila, and
yeah.
simply having your computer on and getting paid while doing nothing. Well, we say no. We say no to that. The state has a divine purpose. It has a divine purpose. Why? Because the world is violent enough nowadays. And that is with the presence of the state. And if the state degenerates, well, man would come back to the state of nature. And let's remember that order creates
freedom.
And this order creates
servitude.
So civil servants should always remember that they are the ones who are keeping the world, their citizens, from servitude itself. Wow. Through preserving order.
And while within our own states we have government, the international sphere is a state of nature.
Of course.
The international,
Let's be honest, less and less. At least
especially with the development of the United Nations, with the development of things like other liberal institutions.
We could say those are facade, let's be honest. At many levels, those are facades.
They have no coercive power, but they represent a sort of agreement, a
but
certain
still,
covenant.
It's a great achievement for since the Treaty of Westphalia, right? That
yes.
men get into a room and at least start discussing that. The fact that we could be united, we could discuss events in a room and establish rules.
And rather than point swords at each other, they point pens at each other.
Yes.
Yes. So the philosophy of liberalism, what it means essentially is individual rights, civil liberties, and economically it means a free market. As was discussed in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, you have the invisible hand, which is just the will of the people directing the demands of the market. Now, the philosophy of liberalism is in big danger these days. And why do I say that? Because it's a philosophy based on a figment of imagination, which is the state of nature.
Let's be honest, like nowadays the non-regulated market is literally the economic state of nature.
And the state of nature, now it never actually happened. It was never an anthropological period in human history. It was a figment of the imagination. It was political theorists making a thought experiment. But we had things to contain the state of nature. There were certain institutions which contained men from eating other men.
The role of the state is to soften men's suffering.
To contain it. We had things like the church, the institution of the family, strong institutions, so on and so forth. These elements contained the state of nature. But now with the movement of the modernization, where we have, we cannot blame it entirely on modernization, but there has been a growing deficit in the public trust towards their institutions, towards things like faith, towards things like family. It is in this sense that those containers have degraded, that the state of nature is more relevant today than ever. We are in the hyper-competitive age. We are in the state of nature. The 21st century is man against man.
You said something really interesting. Yes, the church, for example, after the fall of Rome, the only institution that kept men from the state of nature was, in fact,
the church.
The Catholic Church.
Yes.
Because princes, of course, the sons of the barbarian warlords, used to get educated because they wanted to become like the conquered. And that is the genius of the church. The church can even conquer the conqueror.
Wow.
The church can educate the barbarian who conquered Rome into becoming more Roman. For example, the Visigoth warrior who just conquered and pillaged a part of Western Europe is going to send his son to a monastery. And his son is going to shave his chest, is going to shave his beard, is going to look more Roman, is going to get in touch with the Roman way of life. And that kept together the society after the fall of Rome. The church tames the passions of men and keeps him from getting deep into the state of nature, meaning chaos, meaning servitude.
crazy.
That is crazy. I've just made it up.
You just pieced all of that together right now.
Yes.
You just made all those connections.
Yes.
Dude, that's why we got to stick together. Bro.
I know.
It's a
my friend.
literal chemical
I know.
reaction.
I know.
Hobbes was talking about what is science. That is science. That's chemical reaction.
Well, you know, Plato in his Republic, he said, the only way, and by the way, that is the essence of that podcast. Why are we having a discussion and not just each one of us individually talking to the camera? Because why do we have Plato's Republic at the end of each
Why is
one
it our
of,
profile picture?
and why do we have at the end of each of our reels the Academy of Plato? We have Plato and Aristotle discussing, because we truly believe that men can only learn through discussions.
Yes.
Myself and Nikita, we met at university, and the one thing that was bothering us was the lack of discussion between professor and student, because we truly believe that the only way to learn is through hearing and listening people discuss, sharpen their swords together.
Yes.
Me and Nikita,
Yes.
we agree on most subjects, but not on everything. So the way that we sharpen our swords, our ideas together, makes people individually make up with conclusions for themselves. And that is the beauty of it. And that is why podcasts are getting more and more popular nowadays.
That's why they're displacing the mainstream media. A podcast is just a modern day's Plato Republic. You have two guys discussing with each other. How is this any different than...
But wait, what is Plato's Republic? Plato's Republic
It's a
is a
dialogue.
discussion.
It's
It's
a
a dialogue
dialogue.
between Plato and Aristotle.
and Socrates.
Socrates, sorry.
And there's a couple of other features in there too. Like sometimes the podcast has a guest. But the main personalities are Plato and Socrates. Sometimes they have a guest. It's just a podcast. It's a written podcast.
So I would say that Thomas Hobbes, especially nowadays, is completely relevant for any young man who's in business, who wants to have a family, who wants to understand the complexities and the nature of men.
Who recognizes that he's in constant competition. Who recognizes that his life is just his will clashing against the will of others.
And especially for any citizen who needs to understand the importance of the state and its preservation. It is really important to preserve the state, and especially nowadays we're seeing that social media is convincing many young men to create chaos all around them. Well, remember, young man, chaos creates
Servitude.
and order creates.
Freedom. It's in your interest. If you are a man, you're simply pursuing your interest. And your interest is to have those conditions which allow you to expand yourself.
To innovate.
To innovate, to expand, to actualize your personality.
In most Western
Yes.
countries, the two main elements of the state of nature are achieved, meaning safety
Yes.
and resources.
Yes.
You have access to safety in most parts
There's a
of the
police force, a legal apparatus, laws, contracts, culture even. Culture, don't forget culture.
You have resources.
Oh.
I bet most people, of course, not all of them, and it's a shame, have access to the resources they need: water,
Food,
electricity, etc.,
Roof
etc.
above the head.
But now, all you need to do is to achieve status.
Yes.
And status is achieved through a softened state of nature. And to that, I would say that was an incredible video, incredible discussion.
No, crazy. Like, we went on an adventure through, like, antiquity to modernity.
Yes.
And because of Thomas Hobbes, because of one of the most important books in the canon of our philosophy,
Yes.
which a book written in 1642, which is relevant to this day.
Well, voila.
Voila!
Voilà qui je suis. Mais voilà, même ici, mes années c'est fini. C'est mes voeux, c'est mon cri. Mais voilà, tant pis.